All right, strap in for today's deep dive. We're tackling a truly heavy story, one that ripped through the headlines. Aliya Fakhri, the sister of Bollywood star Nargis Fakhri, has been indicted for murder and arson. It's a case that juxtaposes the glitz and glam of Bollywood against a really shocking, grim, real-life tragedy.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those cases that makes you just stop and think, how could something like this even happen?
Right. That's what we're here to do, too. We're going to try to figure that out. We've got this article from the Economic Times laying out all the details. We're going to break it all down, piece by piece, to try and understand what led to this awful tragedy.
Beyond just the what happened, though, I think what we should really try to get at is the why. What could possibly push someone to such a desperate act?
Absolutely, the why. So let's start with the basics. It's November 2nd, 2024. A fire breaks out in a garage in Queens, New York. Inside, two people, 35-year-old Edward Jacobs and 33-year-old Anastasia Etienne. They both lose their lives, tragically, from the smoke and the flames.
And Aliya Fakhri is the one who is accused of setting that fire. And not only that, there are eyewitnesses that say they heard her shouting, "You're all going to die today," right before the fire started.
Whoa. Chilling, right? Sends chills down your spine. Makes you wonder, what was going on in her head at that moment? Now she's been indicted on multiple counts of murder and arson, which means that if she's convicted, she's looking at a really, really serious sentence, potentially even life in prison.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. I mean, legally speaking, the prosecution is going to have to prove premeditation. They have to convince a jury that this wasn't some kind of accident. This was deliberate. This fire was set on purpose as an act of revenge.
Okay, I see. Wow, a true crime level investigation.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's just the legal side of it. Then you've got the human element, the emotional fallout. Edward's mother, Janet, she describes Aliya as struggling to let go, to accept that her relationship with Edward was over. Apparently, he tried to break up with her about a year before the fire.
And this is where the psychology of it all comes in. Breakups are hard, right? They're messy, especially when one person isn't ready to move on. You've got the denial, the anger, the bargaining. But in this case, it seems like all of those emotions got taken to a really dangerous extreme.
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider that, according to Janet, Edward's relationship with Anastasia was purely platonic, just friends.
Yeah.
So you have this mix of intense emotions, jealousy, rejection, maybe even a sense of betrayal.
Right. And then on top of all of that, we can't ignore the information from Aliya's mother. She says she doesn't believe that her daughter would ever hurt anyone. But she also revealed that Aliya has been battling an opioid addiction.
Wow.
Now, we have to be careful about drawing a direct line between the two, but research has shown a possible connection between opioid use and heightened aggression and impulsivity.
So we're starting to see this convergence of factors here, a difficult breakup, the pain of rejection, and the possible impact of addiction. It's a reminder that actions don't just happen. There are always underlying causes, things that contribute to someone's behavior.
And that's why we need to take a deeper look at the nuances of this case. Was this truly an act of revenge, fueled by heartbreak, and possibly intensified by addiction? Or are there other things at play here? Things we haven't even uncovered yet.
That's what we're going to try to find out. As we continue this deep dive, we need to go beyond the headlines, beyond that initial shock, to understand this complex interplay of emotions, of circumstances, and the potentially devastating consequences of addiction. So we've been talking about all this emotional turmoil that could have been going on in Aliya's life. But what are the legal side of all this? I mean, she's facing really serious charges, but what does that actually mean?
Well, let's break down those charges a little. We've got first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and arson. Each of those carries a lot of weight legally, and they really speak to the seriousness of this crime.
Right. So first-degree murder, that's the most serious one, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. For a first-degree murder conviction, the prosecution has to prove to the jury that this wasn't just intentional, it was premeditated, meaning Aliya planned this. The fire was set deliberately. An act of revenge, not just a heat-of-the-moment decision.
And second-degree murder, what's the difference?
Second-degree murder is a little more complicated. It still means there was intent to cause harm, but not necessarily a plan to kill, so it could be argued that Aliya meant to scare Edward and Anastasia, maybe damage the garage, but didn't actually intend to end their lives.
Makes you think about those moments right before the fire.
Yeah.
Was she just enraged, driven by all those raw emotions we talked about? Was there a moment where her actions shifted from reckless to intentionally harmful?
Those are the exact questions that the jury will have to consider. And it will all come down to the evidence and witness testimony. The prosecution will likely try to show a pattern of behavior, pointing to any past incidents where Aliya was aggressive or threatening toward Edward. They'll also want to dig into her mental state, maybe even bring in expert witnesses to talk about how opioid addiction can affect judgment and impulse control.
I see. So what about the defense? What might their strategy be?
Well, the defense could argue that Aliya was under the influence of drugs at the time and that her judgment was impaired, which led to this tragic accident. They might even try to claim diminished capacity, saying that her mental state was so compromised that she couldn't have formed the intent to commit murder.
It's fascinating how all this legal strategy ties back into the psychology and emotions of the case. It becomes not just a question of what happened, but why it happened, and how much control Aliya actually had. And then there's the impact on the families involved. We've talked about Janet, Edward's mother, and her grief and anger. But then you have Aliya's mother, too. She's in this impossible position, trying to reconcile the daughter she knows with this horrific act she's accused of.
It's unimaginable, really. That sense of dissonance must be so difficult to deal with.
It's like their whole world has been shattered, and they're just left trying to pick up the pieces, trying to understand something that seems completely senseless.
This case is a harsh reminder of the ripple effects of tragedy. It's not just the victims who suffer, it's their loved ones, their families, their friends. Lives are changed forever, and the scars of this event will probably last for years to come.
It makes you wonder, what if things had been different? What if Aliya had gotten help for her addiction? Could this whole tragedy have been prevented?
It's impossible to say for sure, but it does make you think about access to addiction treatment. Are we doing enough to help those struggling with substance abuse? Are we recognizing the signs and stepping in early enough?
Yeah, are we?
These are big systemic issues, and they need our attention.
We have to move beyond judgment and stigma. We need to create a culture of support and understanding. Addiction is a disease, not a moral feeling. And we need to offer compassion and resources to those who need them most.
Absolutely. And remember, if you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, you're not alone. There are resources out there. Helplines, support groups, treatment centers. Reaching out for help is the first step toward recovery.
We'll be sure to include some of those resources in the show notes for this episode. Now, I think as we dig deeper into this case, it's time to shift our focus to the victims, to Edward and Anastasia. We've heard about Edward through his mother. But who was Anastasia? What was her story?
You're right. That's a crucial point. A lot of times in cases like this, the focus becomes so much about the perpetrator that the victims get lost in the shuffle. But their lives matter. Their stories deserve to be told. We need to remember them and acknowledge the tremendous loss that their families and friends are going through.
It's a reminder that behind all the headlines and the legal battles, there are real people whose lives were cut short. They had dreams, aspirations, relationships. It's a devastating loss.
So in the final part of our deep dive, let's focus on Edward and Anastasia. Let's learn about who they were, what their lives were like before this terrible event. It's a way to humanize them, to see them as individuals, not just victims in this tragic story.
It feels important to take a moment here to remember Edward and Anastasia. You know, it's so easy to get caught up in the legal stuff, the charges, all of that. But we have to remember that two people lost their lives.
Yeah, I agree. Their stories are important. And it's really sad that we don't know more about Anastasia.
No, the article really focuses on Aliya and what happened before the fire. So Anastasia's life, it's kind of, it's sort of left in the shadows.
Yeah.
But even with what little we know, we can get a glimpse of who she was. We know she was 33 years old. And that she and Edward had known each other for a while, long enough to be close friends. Edward's mother even said that their relationship was platonic, which I think says a lot about their mutual respect and care for each other.
It does.
And her actions during the fire, they really speak to her character.
What do you mean?
Well, she tried to wake Edward up when she realized the garage was on fire.
Oh, wow.
That's incredible bravery, selflessness. She could have just tried to escape herself, but her first instinct was to protect her friend.
Yeah, that's powerful.
It shows how strong their bond must have been.
Yeah.
And it's just another reminder of the human cost of this whole tragedy.
Absolutely. We also can't forget the trauma that both families are going through. I mean, losing someone you love is never easy, but to have it happen in such a horrific way, it just adds another layer of pain and complexity to their grief.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to zoom out a little and look at the bigger picture.
What do you mean?
Well, for me, what really sticks out is that this isn't just some sensational news story. This is a real tragedy, that's left so much devastation behind. It makes you think about how fragile life is, how complex human relationships are, and the potential consequences of not dealing with emotional pain and addiction.
You're right.
It's like a wake-up call.
Yeah.
We need to be more aware of the people around us, be there for them, offer support, and fight for better mental health and addiction resources.
I couldn't agree more.
We can't change what happened, but we can learn from it and try to build a more understanding and compassionate society.
Exactly.
And to everyone listening, I hope this deep dive has gotten you thinking critically about the information you come across, to look beyond the surface and consider all the different factors that contribute to events like this.
It's about being more aware, more empathetic, and more involved in creating positive change.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. It's been a tough topic to discuss.
It has.
But one that's so important to think about and reflect on.
Until next time, everyone, stay curious, stay informed, and stay compassionate